Hello, everyone. I am LT World, and you're listening to the Light the World podcast. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an author and writer deeply interested in controversial issues and beliefs. And on this channel, we'll be striving to better understand different beliefs, different topics, and different controversial things and philosophies. And we'll do this by looking at the history of a topic, and then also by looking at all sides of the issue, for it or against it, or however many positions there are to cover. So, if you enjoy these type of things, please give it a listen. If you like what you hear, or you look forward to more of these, please subscribe or follow on whatever platform you're on. And you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter and discover more about me and my writing, my works, and other things I do at ltworld.info. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. So, last episode, we talked about the history of critical theory. We kind of talked about Karl Marx, and we talked about the Frankfurt School, and then we talked about how in like 1937 or so, Max Horkheimer coined the phrase critical theory. So we kind of left off there, and now it's time to kind of delve into, all right, what are some of the arguments for critical theory, and what are some of the main tenets and main points of critical theory? So we're going to start off by just recapping what is the definition of critical theory. And again, Max Horkheimer, when he defined critical theory, he defined it in terms of what it wasn't as well as what it is. So he contrasted it to what he called a traditional theory. And a traditional theory, he basically assumes that people are unbiased observers of facts, and that they use these facts then to describe the world as it is. While critical theory, on the other hand, takes in another element where it believes, no, actually, our perception of the world is conditioned by society to think a certain way. And since facts are observations have been manipulated by society, we must critique social norms, we must critique theories, and we must critique ideologies, because everything is being socially molded and constructed, and actually there isn't necessarily an objective overarching truth to observe, at least not observe in an unbiased fashion or objectively. And so he kind of makes that distinction that critical theory is designed to critically look at all belief systems, all ideologies, because they are all socially constructed. And so that's kind of a difference between a critical theory and a traditional theory, according to Max Horkheimer. So in this episode today, in this podcast, we'll be covering three main arguments that people use to support critical theory. So these are the three arguments that we'll be covering today. No one can objectively view the world because they have been socially molded. All knowledge is socially constructed and molded. People need to see how they're oppressed by ideologies to be able to see how they can be liberated, or this is sort of the social justice angle of critical theory. So let's just jump into the first one, and we're going to jump into the pro side. What are people saying in support of no one can objectively view the world? So, how do I want to start this off? Everyone is, when you were born, you were raised with a certain set of values. Whether you're a Christian, whether you're a Muslim, whether you're atheist, you have been raised with a certain set of values to believe things in a certain way. You've been raised, for instance, that it's not right to murder someone. You also been raised with the value or the belief that you should do this or you should do that. Specifically speaking, in the West, in America specifically, you live in a capitalist society, so you believe in like the private rights, and you believe in individual rights, and you believe in property rights, and you believe in these different rights that you believe you have or deserve. So everyone's raised with a certain set of values, and we're all molded by society. And every society is different. So, like, if I would go to the Middle East, a lot of people there would be more Muslim in nature. They'd be more conservative. They'd be more in those lines. If I'd go to China, they'd be raised more in a mercantile economy. If I go to Soviet Union or North Korea, it'd be more communist in nature. And so there's a social construction to all of this. And when we take in information, then we take in information with those biases in mind. So we already have these perceptions, and we're already told that. So, for instance, Karl Marx would have made the argument that as a capitalist society, we think we have private rights. I mean, we think that land should be privately owned, or we believe that there should be an open economy. But that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. That's actually not a truth. That's actually not something that is a right. That's something that's socially constructed that we believe we deserve. And we ought to deconstruct that, because it actually might be oppressing more people than not. It might not be good for us. And in the very same way, Max Horkheimer makes that same claim, but for a much broader scale. Most truth, or all knowledge, is socially constructed in that regard then. There's actually a quote from Horkheimer that I believe also shows how he believes that people are not cannot objectively view the world, and it kind of goes with the idea that people are biased and that they don't even know it. And so here's the quote from Horkheimer from his essay Traditional Theory versus Critical Theory. As man reflectively records reality, he separates and rejoins pieces of it and concentrates on some particulars while failing to notice others. This process is just as much a result of the modern mode of production as a perception of a man and tribe of primitive hunters and fishers and the result of the conditions of his existence. So essentially, people focus on facts and observations that they have biases or perceptions or leanings towards. People will look at a study and you might say that that study is objective, for instance, a scientific study or some sort of biologist or whatever it may be. That may be a study that has rigor, has evidence, has facts, things like that. But when we observe it, when we look at it, we're looking at it from a certain lens. So we might be looking at a study on evolution, let's just say that. And we'll be looking at it from a capitalist lens. So we're looking at it like, how can this help bolster up my ideology of capitalism? Or how can this support it? And you would read all the facts and observations through that lens and therefore interpret it in those lens and then share that information and knowledge through that lens. And because you're not objective, you cannot objectively view the world. And therefore, you already have these preset biases, and every information you read will be read through those perceptions. And therefore, every ideology, every study, every knowledge needs to be deconstructed because you're not objective. You are impossible for you to objectively view the world because you have been molded and raised by society to think a certain way and to perceive things a certain way, and therefore it's impossible for you to see the world objectively. And at least that's how the pro side goes. So what is the flip side then? What is the contrary thought to this line of thinking? And the first thing that gets brought up is, well, if that's the case, then why should I listen to you? It's kind of like the same thing. Like we had whoever listened to postmodernism series, we did the exact same thing. The con sides, the pro side said, well, there is no objective truth, or no one can know what truth is, and then the con side said, well, that applies to you as well. So if every person isn't objective, every person's biased and flawed, and if for some reason that makes knowledge hard to understand or makes facts irrelevant or whatever it may be, then it applies to the person asserting that theory. So why should I believe that people aren't objective, or that you can't objectively think, or that you're biased or whatever? Why should I believe you then? Why should I listen to you? If that impacts my ideologies, if that impacts my theories, if that makes me unable to assert truth for whatever reason, then that should apply to you as well. But when you have to assert critical theory, you have to defend critical theory as a person who's biased, who is unable to see the world objectively. And you have to claim it as an objective truth. You have to claim critical theory as an objective means to study the world, or as a means to study the world, or how people ought to study the world. But you're not biased. You're biased. You're not objective. So you just counteracted yourself. And so that doesn't really help. That doesn't really get us anywhere. Social factors may impact how we observe information. So I don't want to completely ignore the fact that perhaps, yeah, we're influenced by society and how we perceive things. True, sure. But that doesn't necessarily mean we can't observe truth objectively. It doesn't mean that truth cannot be determined just because we have our perceptions or have our biases. Perhaps, as that Horkheimer quote said, we focus in on certain truths. It doesn't make that truth now untrue. We may attach to it some interpretations that aren't true, or that may be our own opinions, but that doesn't make that truth no more objective than it was when it came to me, and I can objectively observe that in that sense. So I might not be able to observe all truth, or I may ignore certain truth, but it doesn't mean I can't objectively observe the truth that I do see. And we also must assume that if perception and bias doesn't allow us to objectively view the truth, we must then assume that truth can't basically reveal itself or be revealed otherwise. Let me rephrase that. So we have to assume that truth is something that we discover and that we reveal to ourselves. Because if my perception on the world or my lack of objectivity makes it that truth cannot be known, or that truth is not objective, or whatever it may be, that assumes then that my perception impacts my ability to objectively view the truth. But what if it would be a way around that truth reveals itself to us, and that we discover it through that means, or that truth actually can be revealed despite our biases and perceptions? We must assume that truth can't do that. We must assume that truth cannot overcome our perceptions. So, in other words, as I already kind of stated before, as I talked about, Karl Marx was an atheist. Most critical theorists are pragmatists, meaning they don't really believe in a spiritual world, and they tend to be more atheistic in nature and more naturalistic. So they must assume there's no spiritual realm. They must assume that there is no other factor playing in here besides nature and society. Because otherwise, if there's a spiritual realm, well then this might completely alter how this theory works. So another con side to this, another thing that people say in disagreement to the critical theory, is that, hey, you're too narrow-minded. You don't even consider spiritual into your equation. And I obviously favor more the opposition side, because if you're biased as a person, and that makes somehow my ideologies or my theories less valuable or less objective, well, then that applies to you as well for your theories, and that includes critical theory. So this kind of counteracts itself in that regard. So the next point, though, kind of piggybacking off the idea that people can't be objective, is the fact that all knowledge is socially constructed or politically molded. Now, I do need to make a little bit of a caveat here, need to explain that there are two kind of positions on this one. So there's what they call strong social constructionism versus weak social constructionism. The idea that all knowledge is socially constructed. The weak version says, no, there are some core tenet truths that we can know, or that we can understand, because they're not dependent on any other facts or truths, that they stand alone, and they're kind of like the fundamentals, if you say. But everything else outside of those, all knowledge outside of those core facts and truths, is socially constructed. However, the strong social constructionist would say, no, even though there is no such thing as a fundamental truth, there is no such thing as a truth that doesn't depend on other truths or facts. All truth is socially constructed. All knowledge is socially constructed. Therefore, it's impossible to escape. Now, in this regard, as far as Horkheimer's view on this, he claimed fallibilism rather than relativism. He suggested that the methods we obtain knowledge through are socially constructed, therefore fallible, but he didn't necessarily deny the fact that there may be truth out there, or that truth is, that he wouldn't have claimed that there was no truth, or he wouldn't have been a complete relativist, but he would have claimed fallibility for all people, which isn't really that much better, but to each their own, I guess. He would have stated that piggybacking off the last point, he would have stated that since people aren't objectives, that since people are socially molded and constructed, that this makes knowledge socially constructed or politically molded, because how do we learn? We learn through communication, we learn through observation, we learn through all these different means, but they all are already influenced by society. So let's take, for instance, the fact that I go to school and I learn about mathematics, or I learn about science. I'm learning through communication. A teacher is communicating to me knowledge, I'm taking it in, I'm writing it down, I do an exam. That has been transmitted to me by someone who's already socially molded. Or if I observe nature on my own, let's just say there is no person involved in the equation. Let's just say I go outside, I look up, an apple falls from the apple tree, and it bonks me on the head. And we're going full Newton on this one. You might say, oh, well, I observed something. It's not socially constructed. Well, maybe not necessarily. I mean, let's just take, for instance, the fact that you already have been socially constructed. Your parents raised you. Who raised you? Why are you old enough to observe and take in information? Because you have been raised by your parents. You have been treated by a community and family. Therefore, you are socially constructed, and therefore when you observe this knowledge about gravity, you're actually viewing it through the lens of whatever values you were raised with. So it's inescapable. Since you're already not objective, then therefore all knowledge is socially constructed, because you're socially constructed and you understand information within your own head, and that's how you understand and come to your knowledge. Knowledge is come to through revelation. Revelation is come through your psyche and through your mind, and your mind is molded by people. It's impossible then, therefore, to escape social construction of knowledge, because all of it's constructed because you're constructed. And since we learn mostly through human interaction anyway, that just makes up most of it, that we're biased people are teaching biased people, and therefore biases are being passed around and being passed off as objective knowledge, when actually it's socially constructed knowledge, or so a critical theorist would claim. But to be fair, Horkheimer would have focused primarily on ideologies and social norms specifically, because some of the natural sciences, he's harder for him to let's just say it's hard for him to explain away because the natural sciences are much more probably rigorous in the fact of their facts and their evidence, while social values and stuff are a little bit more flippant, perhaps, or a little bit more subject to interpretation. So Horkheimer and these critical theorists of his age in Frankfurt School focus more on like economy, focus more on social values, focus more on religion, because they were easier to reinterpret. The sciences like like math, like 4 plus 4 equals 8, or the sciences like physics, gravity, law of gravity, they're a little bit harder to fit into the critical theory perspective, and a little harder to claim to be completely socially constructed. Although Horkheimer does have the quote where he says, even where there's a question of experiencing natural objects as such, their very naturalness is determined by contrast with the social world, and to that extent depend upon the latter. Essentially what Horkheimer is saying is that we distinguish science, and we get in the facts of science are distinguished contrast to social norms and the social world. So when I observe gravity, I'm able to know what gravity is because from what it's not, as postmodernists would claim, and as we talked about in our last episode. So since I know what gravity isn't, I know what it is, and since I know it isn't it isn't politics, or it isn't the social world, by contrasting it to the social world has an impact on how I perceive gravity. So therefore, in a way, it's inescapable. All knowledge is socially constructed, even including the sciences in the natural world. Or so it goes. Now, obviously, as we all know, there's always two sides to the coin. There's always two sides to the argument. And one of the first arguments that people bring up about whether or not knowledge is socially constructed is the natural sciences. Actually, Khan Academy brought this up, and I didn't really think about it until I read it in Khan Academy. I was like, oh yeah, that is true. Critical theory cannot take into account nature and natural phenomenon not determined by human interaction or perception. So, although Horkheimer tries to make a stretch here, I would say, where he's like, well, since we contrast all things to their differences, your social world will be that one, therefore socially constructed. That's kind of I would say, a weak position to take. Because by that logic, you could say anything is certainly constructed because it's not whatever. And then it's a game of what nots. And that's an endless game. You could do that for almost anything. So, critical theory, it can't really take into account the natural sciences. They don't really know how to fit that into their theory. So they just kind of make these weak arguments to connect it. But again, it goes back to that kind of question of like, so what? So let's just go back to the facts. Like, so what? So what if critical theory is true? Or what if knowledge is socially constructed? Again, that would impact the person saying that. And what I mean by that is you would have to be claiming to have knowledge, that knowledge is socially constructed, and then be using that as an argument. So it's kind of counteractive. So by using knowledge and by using your perception, by using your worldview to claim that knowledge is socially constructed, but that also applies to you, but you're claiming that to be objective. You're claiming that theory to be objective, but it's not objective because you just claim that things can't be objective because knowledge is socially constructed. But you're using knowledge to claim an objective theory. If you say that, no, critical theorists, actually, they're critical of their own theory because they don't think anything's objective, well then, what's the point? It doesn't even make any sense then. It just completely makes everything flippant and completely meaningless. And if you can't understand anything, well then why care about what anyone says? It makes everything irrelevant, kind of like postmodernism. That was kind of the same issue I had with postmodernism those last couple episodes. What does it mean? What does it matter? You have deconstructed yourself. A deconstructionist is only effective if the parameters they establish don't deconstruct their own theory. So if you are a deconstructionist and you create parameters that deconstruct your own theory while doing so, you have made yourself completely null and void, and who cares what you have to say. And again, I'm not denying the fact that society influences how we think or how we view truth or how we learn. But what I am saying, it doesn't necessarily make things completely unobjective. I believe you can still objectively understand things, or you can still claim there's objective truth, despite the fact that society influences how we think. And I can partially say this because as a Christian, I believe that God does reveal truth to us, that God does help us understand truth, despite our failures, despite our biases, despite our sins, despite our flaws and insights. God does help reveal to us truth in a spiritual way. How that completely works, I'm not entirely sure. I'm not going to delve into that, at least on this podcast, in this episode. But you can't take that into account in critical theory. And again, because critical theory only looks through social lens and through a naturalistic lens, and you can't really do much with that. However, normally the main thrust, the thing that people mainly hang their hat on when it comes to critical theory, isn't necessarily the argument for social constructionism, mainly because social constructionism kind of makes everything irrelevant, or it kind of counteracts itself. But normally they focus on the goal of social justice. So a lot of times, everyone knows about critical race theory now because it's all over the news, it's all over the place. Everyone knows about gender theory, transgenderism, and like LGBT, that whole community. Everyone knows about feminism, and everyone knows about these different movements, and they all are rooted in critical theory. And normally a lot of the premises of these movements is that a lot of the premises of these movements that we have been oppressed, we haven't been given our rights, we've been held down, and we weren't able to express ourselves, things like that. We deserve equal treatment, equal rights, just as everyone else does, and we should be allowed to do these things, X, Y, and Z, whatever. And a lot of these are rooted in critical theory, and normally in critical theorists, in Max Horkheimer and Frankfurt School and Karl Marx and all these different people leading up to what we now have as the critical theories as a wide variety, it was all about the fact that people ought to become aware of their biases, their assumptions, their social constructions, and their oppressions, in a way, so that they can realize how they're oppressed by societal standards rather than truth. So Max Horkheimer and the Frankfurt School believed that people believe things to be true that weren't true. So like values, like for instance, let's just take the gender binary. A lot of talk about there is not we view things as a gender binary because that's a Western value, that's a Western thought, and actually gender is malleable and can be many things. Therefore, there isn't a binary. That isn't true. That's actually an ideology that's been socially constructed. So that would be an example of what they would call a societal standard that's oppressing people, because people may not fit within that binary, therefore they may not be able to express themselves, therefore they may be oppressed, depressed, it may affect their mental health, whatever. And you can't actually know if you're oppressed unless you critically look at your ideologies, critically look at truth, critically look at knowledge, and deconstruct it and see it for what it actually is. So, again, most of the time, the social justice aspect of it is looking for ways to deconstruct society, looking for ways to deconstruct values and social norms so that they can express themselves in a certain way, or that they can claim rights that they believe they ought to have. And it normally comes back to this fact that I'm being oppressed by social norm that's actually not true, or that doesn't actually explain the world as it is. And that's more of the emotional side. That's more of the where you get these movements from. However, obviously there's a contrary people who disagree with this perspective of social justice. First of all, I just want to point out, it assumes that liberation is a good thing. So, by asserting that people ought to critically look at their social norms, critically look at their values, and then liberate themselves from things that may oppress them, or liberate themselves from society, or liberate themselves from these things so that they can be free, assumes that liberation is good, assumes that freedom is good, assumes that this kind of freedom is good, and it assumes that liberation from social norms or from social constructs is good. But that in of itself is an ideology. That in of itself is a value system. That in of itself is a moral good. That in of itself is a value. Well, wouldn't that be a social construct? And who says that people want to be liberated? Who says that liberation is good for mental health? Maybe not everyone who's liberated from these social norms per se would be better off. They actually may be oppressed by this new value that you have asserted about liberation being good. And so it's kind of a catch-22. It kind of puts itself in a pickle. And since if we want to go down that route of most critical theorists are naturalists or more atheistic in nature, then upon what moral standard are we saying is good and bad? Upon what moral standard are we saying freedom, or this that people ought to have their rights, or people ought to be free? Upon what moral standard are we basing this on? Whose opinion are we basing this on? And what does a healthier society look like? What standard are you going to provide? And if you provide any standard, you're providing an ideology. You're providing your own biased opinion. So it's kind of contrary. It counteracts itself. And again, this critical theory falls into the same pit holes postmodernism does, and the fact that it counteracts itself, and the good that it promotes, the social justice end of it, it doesn't tend to make much sense. It tends to lead to more anarchy society. It tends to lead more to this moral relativism. It tends to lead more to this chaos normally. So I don't believe critical theory at the end of the day makes that much sense. I see. Hopefully I didn't come across as rude or anything, because I know there's a lot of people out there who believe critical theory, or at least believe different aspects of it, like CRT and stuff like that. I don't. I understand to a certain extent where the arguments come from. I understand that we are all socially. We ought to be aware of our social biases. We ought to be aware of how things that may be ideological but not necessarily true, or things that may be asserted upon us that actually do oppress us or that do hurt us. I'm not saying we shouldn't be absent-minded or not think about the world we live in, but I don't think that necessarily it should be a sweeping thing that we say, no, we can't objectively know truth, we can't objectively know values, or there are no social norms out there that are good, because then that must assume that there is no social norms that are good, or assume that there is no moral values that are overarching, and by that we're already getting rid of the idea of God. And again, I really want to cover that topic some point. So I just don't think critical theory holds up on its own terms. I think from a spiritual end, it's very, it doesn't take into account the spiritual, and I just don't think it makes much sense on its own terms. I don't think now if no one's objective, then therefore the people asserting the theory can't be objective. If knowledge is socially constructed, therefore all the knowledge you're using to assert your claims are socially constructed. And if the goal is social justice, on whose terms are we looking for freedom? On whose terms are we looking for what is morally good? On whose terms is this justice? I don't think it holds up, and I think it's rather weak then. But I would love to continue to study a topic. I will continue to study a topic, and I encourage everyone else to study a topic because it's very prevalent. And I want everyone to keep learning. And maybe I missed something along the way, and I always love to talk to people who disagree with me. So I'm going to continue to learn, and hopefully you guys continue to learn about this. But yeah, so that is critical theory wrapped up. Now, next time, I don't really have a planned topic yet. I have a couple ideas I would like to do, but actually I want to leave it up to you guys. So if there's a topic out there that you would want me to cover, you want me to study and to talk about, please leave it in the comment section if you're on like YouTube or something, or if you know me in person, just talk to me in person or text me or something. But yeah, I would like to see if there's any topics out there that people would like me to cover. And if you follow me on Instagram or something, you can like DM me something like that. So yeah, I would like to hear from you guys if there's a topic you would want me to cover. But that being said, thank you for being with me. If you want to check out more of my stuff, you can go to ltworld.info. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. And I do have a YouTube channel, and on that YouTube channel I do post a couple other videos outside of this podcast that are shorter, more humorous, but still cover topics that educate people. So yeah, so thank you for listening, and now please go out there and light the world, my friends.